Hi. Hi, everybody. Sorry to interrupt your lovely chatting, but we have another session coming to you. So, my name is Jean Dahlquist. I'm a board member with Housing Land Advocates, and I have a script to read. But if, hello? Hello? Oh, okay, this is back to work. I have a script to read, but if you know anything about me, you know that I don't really follow scripts. So, I'm going to let Mary introduce herself because she knows herself way better than I know her, though I'm excited to get to know her more. I think the most important part about this talk is how hard it was to find someone with Mary's knowledge. Like we've all seen and felt some of the aftermath of the fires that happened a few years back. And I don't know about you, but my first instinct was, well, what are we doing about this? What's happening to the people who live there? How are we going to rebuild? What's happening in the immediate aftermath? Where are these people going? How are they going to live until things are rebuilt? Thank you again for that wonderful insurance panel, kind of talking about how we can rebuild some of these communities that have been lost. And I kept talking to people and no one knew. Nobody really knew what happened immediately after. Nobody really knew how we were planning on rebuilding when this happens again, because let's be real, climate change is real and it is going to happen again. And so I think one of the most important things about listening to Mary right now is that we do know more about what happens after a tragedy. And so we can influence that process for better moving forward. So I wanted to thank Mary again for her time and her expertise. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. So please, everybody, join me in welcoming Mary to the stage.
Right. I'm short, so hopefully this works. Okay. Yes, perfect. All right. So when Jean initially emailed me, I was really excited and I wanted to have a panel with all these folks, and then it didn't end up working out. And she's like, guess what? I'm going to make you a keynote instead. So this is my first keynote. So if I talk too fast or if you don't understand what I'm saying, you can talk to me afterwards, and I'm happy to talk further with you about things. So my name's Mary. We're at Portland State University, so I had to shout out the MERT program because I am a graduate. Ooh, I see the students here. Yay. And I'm the External Affairs Coordinator at Oregon Housing and Community Services, which is at the state. And my elevator pitch is that I help communicate about our programs around disaster recovery at OHCS. So I'm going to talk to you about the 2020 wildfires. That is the disaster that we focus on. You'll notice 2020 was 4.5 years ago, and the point is disaster recovery takes a long time. So I will be showing photos of the disasters up at the front. So if that's an uncomfortable situation for you, I'll let you know when they're not there anymore. So we talk a lot about trauma-informed care in our work as well. So let's talk about the 2020 wildfires. So on September 7th, 2020, multiple fires spread rapidly due to historically extreme high winds and dry conditions, burning over 1 million acres across several regions of the state, double the 10-year average. Over 40,000 Oregonians had to evacuate their homes, more than 500,000 were placed on evacuation notice. So the fires happened all across the state in various different regions. We had rural areas and we had urban areas as well. In particular, we had areas where there was a lot of affordable housing, as well as areas where there was a lot of sparse housing as well. In Talent and Phoenix, down in Jackson County, the Alameda fire started as a grass fire and then ended up destroying nearly 2,500 homes in around that area, which was more of our urban areas. You can see here there's a sidewalk, so you're not always going to see that in the rural areas. And on top of that, all of this was happening during some of the heights of the COVID pandemic, which made it even harder in the recovery work immediately aftermath because
folks couldn't gather as a community, which is really important when you've gone through trauma together. That was hard to do when you had to stay 6 feet distance from each other. And that was a real struggle that we heard from survivors of the immediate aftermath being just exacerbated because of the COVID pandemic. So this is the official FEMA map that came from the disaster. Like I said, there were 21 fires in total. 5 of those fires grew into mega fires, which is defined as areas that burn for more than 100,000 acres. At the time, Oregon had never experienced more than one fire over 100,000 acres, and this was 5 in 2020. All of the major fires were contained by early December of 2020. And the red that's shown here on the map, those are the counties that we work in as they're declared by Congress and the president at the time of the disaster. So those are kind of the counties that we are currently working in. Like I said, it's all across the state, but it's kind of along the I-5 corridor, interestingly enough. And like I said, very wide kind of array of needs and uses in these areas as well. So in terms of housing loss, so we are a housing organization. Our focus is on housing. There were over 4,300 homes that were damaged or destroyed, and just under half of those were manufactured homes. We've talked about the term naturally occurring affordable housing. Manufactured home parks are usually some of the last in a community. So it was a really big disaster for some of these folks because they had homes that they owned that were affordable to them. It's never going to be able to live in that sort of situation again, just based on the economy and the housing market as well. And as you can see here, Jackson County down in Southern Oregon was the one that was hit the most. It was also the more urban area. So it sort of made sense. It was more dense and therefore more homes were lost. Okay, and I'm done with any photos if that was something that was a bother to you. So we hear a lot about immediate aftermath. I think that's kind of like the sexy thing that you see covered a lot in terms of media. You'll see FEMA, that's talked about a lot. It's talked about a lot in general nowadays. Military aid, those that are immediately there to help assist with folks that have lost homes or need supplies, food, water, all of that. Mutual and local aid is very common as well. This is from the LA fires where they did a big clothing donation event. And as well as kind of what's happening immediately in terms of state, local, and city kind of regulations. Again, this is LA. They were talking a lot about rent control issues because of folks that lost their homes needing to go to rent places. And there was an issue of people bumping up the prices of rent because they knew more people were going to need that. But what happens 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? Like I said, 2020 was 4.5 years ago, and we are still doing work on the 2020 wildfires. So what does that look like for long-term disaster recovery? And I'm here to talk about it. So we'll start with kind of the funds that came to, we'll only be talking about the funds that came to OHCS because that's where we work. But I want you to note that there are so many other nonprofits, local, city, counties, and also state departments that are doing so much other work as well. We're just focusing on housing in this particular presentation, but know that there's community visioning that's been happening. There has been TGM projects. There has been disaster case management and all sorts of things that kind of all work together in this large ecosystem in terms of recovery. But again, we'll just focus on housing for this presentation. So I wanted to give those folks a shout out because they're doing a lot of work. So let's start with state funding. So in August of 2021, there was the House Bill 5006, which was signed by Governor Brown in August, and it gave $150 million for disaster recovery around housing. Of that $150 million, it was sort of split into 2 ways. $35.3 million went to the Wildfire Recovery and Resilience Account, which we lovingly call WIRA. And then the other leftover amount went to primarily to development of low and moderate income rental and home ownership projects. So that included homes that were lost, but also adding homes into these communities as well. So we'll start with WIRA. It started in the fall of 2021 and completed in the fall of 2023. It was a critical first step in providing support to impacted households quickly and in advance of more comprehensive sort of federal funding that will be coming later, and usually it comes months or sometimes even years after a disaster. So state funding is critical in terms of the short, immediate aftermath of a disaster. So WIRA offered participants intentionally flexible and individualized approaches for housing assistance, usually through community action agencies, so CAAs, long-term recovery groups, and as well as a lot of local community partners. This included rapid rehousing for people who lost their primary residence or were displaced, housing navigation support to complete their recovery, and all of this was under the idea of housing first approach, so trying to create as little barriers as possible to get folks back into temporary or even permanent housing. So the WIRA supported households in 3 areas for financial assistance: rental assistance and related supports. So that included housing rental costs, manufactured home pad leases, utility payments, and even moving costs. And then they also helped with damaged housing replacement, rehabilitation, and reconstruction incentives, and mostly in the form of grants. So that came as manufactured home purchases and installations, rebuilding and repairing manufactured or stick-built homes, and even in some cases converting motels or hotels into temporary housing for folks immediately after the disaster. And then finally, the third is flexible assistance, which is really important because you can't get this kind of assistance through federal funding that we've noticed. It is for furniture replacement. It's for household goods and supplies, even kitchen towels, some of those things, work-related items, so tools and work clothes so that they can continue working that they may have lost in their homes. This is assistance that you're not going to be able to get from a lot of other funding, especially if it's coming from the federal government. So out of WIRA, we also had the other pot of funding that went directly towards rebuilding of housing. We started with building housing that was replacement for homes that were lost, especially manufactured home parks. There are a couple built down in Jackson County that actually became co-op models, which is really awesome. So they're owned by the tenants that live there, as well as, if we could, we added additional units to those existing areas because, as we all know, there is a housing shortage in the state and in the nation as well. And especially in rural communities, there is an extreme lack of housing. So our goal was to also build as much additionally as we can. And we are currently still doing that. So this is not something that has ended yet. It's something that is still happening. In particular, this is Lazy Days in McKenzie River out in Lane County. So we worked with Homes for Good to rebuild a manufactured home park that was burned down. And this was a ribbon cutting that just happened in January of this year. So again, things take a long time to build infrastructure. You all know that. But it's just a long time to do disaster recovery work. And then as OHCS, if you do affordable housing, you probably know a lot about OHCS. We fund a lot of the affordable housing projects, if not all of them in the state. And we were able to work with our other divisions that do affordable rental housing as well as affordable home ownership options. And we worked with them. So if they were building affordable housing in the counties where we had those disaster declared counties, so those 7 of those, we made sure that they had a certain percentage of units that were wildfire preferences. So survivors that met their criteria for income and other things that they needed for the affordable housing, but then also happened to be a wildfire survivor, they were given a more of a priority in terms of being able to move into those projects. So And that was not part of the state funding that we got from House Bill 5006. That just was another area that we chose to work with to make sure that we were, doing a comprehensive approach to help survivors get back home. So from these state-funded efforts, we were able to assist 1,146 survivors. 867 of those were back in permanent, safe, affordable housing. Over 65% of the households that were supported by WIRA were lower income households. So at 80% of very median income or below. And then the average grant award for manufactured home replacements in Jackson County was $97,000. So we're able to help those folks be able to rebuy manufactured homes that they lost. In addition, we're hoping to get over 1,000 additional affordable units in these communities with the work that we're doing in terms of the state funding, as well as with our work with affordable housing developments. And then one thing to note too, which I guess is a very rare situation, which we were going to do this no matter what, however we could, but apparently this doesn't always happen in these disasters, is we ensured that 0 survivors were forced out of FEMA temporary shelters. So when, yeah. So when FEMA closed down its direct housing mission in 2023, so that's 3 years after the disaster, FEMA will eventually leave. We made sure that there were no survivors that were kicked out onto the streets. So we were able to find them either temporary or permanent supportive housing from them. So finally, we'll get into the fun part, which is the federal funding that happens in disaster recovery. So in 2021, the Housing and Urban Development Department, through the federal government, gave the state of Oregon $422 million to address as much of the remaining recovery and mitigation needs as possible from the 2020 wildfires. This was the first community development block grant for disaster recovery for OHCS, probably the first in the state, at least in a couple of decades. We've never had disasters where we needed this kind of funding before, basically. It is a very common situation in southern states of the United States. This kind of work happens a lot. They're much more familiar. So it was a very steep learning curve for all of us, quite frankly, in how to set this up. So unfortunately, if there is another disaster that meets this criteria, we're kind of in a better spot for that. But it's been a really big learning curve for us to figure all of this out, because it's complicated. And you'll see why. So HUD funds are intended for long-term recovery. They're meant to come after any sort of FEMA designation of funds. It's not meant to kind of double together. They deem it as their funding of last resort. I've never liked that term, but it's basically like, this is what you're going to get. There's nothing really left for us to give to you. So HUD requires recipients, usually state or local governments, to design programs that ensure benefits are not being duplicated. And so that's the same work isn't being paid twice. That is a very complicated thing to deal with. And funds must be directed towards those that with the greatest demonstrated financial need. So again, the system is really meant to help those that are still in need of recovery. And usually 3 years after a disaster, it's going to be those that are low income, typically, because they just haven't had the ability and the funds to be able to recover fully yet. The grant process takes a really long time. FEMA has a rolling pot of funds that they can use. CDBG DR funds are allocated individually. So we have to wait for Congress to basically approve a certain number of funding for us. If you can see here, I've put in dates of all of the things that happened for us to get to where we are today. So in September of 2020, it was presidentially declared a disaster. So that is the start of the process. The president has to declare it, and then it moves on. And then it goes to Congress, where in a year later, September of 2021, they approved an allegation for us to receive funding. In February of 2022, it then goes on to HUD, and they're the ones that do the federal register notice, kind of like an official sort of declaration for them. And then in February of 2022, or yes, same February of 2022, we got started, and then it was like all hands on deck, basically, for us to get moving. So that was the start of us doing community engagement process with the communities that were affected to start figuring out what the programming was going to look like. We didn't know what the program was going to look like 2 years after this disaster. So we worked really closely with our partners on the ground, with survivors, to ensure that we were coming up with programs that would benefit them. In May of 2022, we posted our action plan for how we were going to use those funds. That came out of, a lot of research, as well as all of that community engagement process. And then finally, in February of 2023 was when we officially got the grant agreement from HUD. They approved our action plan, and then we could actually implement the work. So note, February of 2023. That's not anywhere near September of 2020. And that's very common for all of these large scale disasters. If you're going to get federal funding through HUD, this is the common practice. So it doesn't show on here, but it was showing in nice colors the layers of complexity when you're dealing with federal funds. If you'll notice, we've got, the federal regulations at the bottom, and then at the very top is like our program policies that we end up coming up with. One thing to note is when you're dealing with federal funds, you're dealing with a lot of things on top of state regulations, on top of local government, county, city regulations, as well as what the folks on the ground would like to see as part of their programming. So there's a lot of complexity that you're dealing with. You're trying to explain a very complex situation to somebody who just wants to get back into their house. And it's a difficult situation to handle. But usually we have, support from HUD to give us sort of technical assistance and resources. And, they're there to help us navigate this situation. But a thing to note too is folks that have to wait for this federal funding then have to adhere to all of these additional guidelines that maybe they didn't have to adhere to if they could have afforded to build before then. So it's kind of an additional layer there. So what did we do with this CDBG-DR funding? We created 5 different areas of programming, and a little over 80% of them is going towards housing. And in terms of what HUD requires, at least 70% of these funds have to be used towards low and moderate income households. So we're trying to meet all of these regulations and standards, as well as trying to make sure our communities can recover. Housing being a very important one, but then we also have resilience planning that we added in, as well as what they call multi-sector on here. We have a more fun name beyond that, but that's for our planning and infrastructure and economic revitalization work that we're planning. And then as well as public services. So I know we have lawyers in here, but their disaster recovery folks need legal services. So that is also in addition to some of the work that we're adding as well. So let's go a little bit into what we do in each program. So the housing program has quite a few different things that we're doing in it. So we are rebuilding, repairing, or refurbishing. That's not the right word. Rebuilding or repairing, basically, homes for homeowners. We're doing rental assistance and utility assistance for renters, as well as eventually down payment assistance for renters that would like to become homeowners. And then we're also building affordable housing. So we're trying to add additional housing stock to these communities where they really need rental and homeownership added because of the shortage that they have found in their communities. We're also doing resilience planning, as I mentioned, as well as housing and recovery services and legal services. And then our other kind of big major pot of funding is this multi-sector. So we're doing planning and infrastructure work, as well as economic revitalization and any sort of mitigation plans. I will also note that economic revitalization, building or business support for disaster recovery is very limited. And so this is something that was a big need that came from our conversations with community members. I think that's all I wanted on that. Yeah. Oh, also we can shift these programs. As we learn more about how things are going, we have already started to shift some of the way that we implement this. In particular, we are changing the way that we're building out the affordable housing. So at first we were just thinking of homeownership opportunities, but we heard from our folks on the ground that they also would want rental opportunities. So we've adjusted that, as well as maximum award amounts for folks. As you all know, construction costs have gone up and it's gotten more expensive to build. And so the amount of awards that we give somebody wouldn't really go as far as we had originally. So we bumped those up. On top of that, we're also working on a reimbursement program. One thing that you also will find in disaster recovery is folks may have been able to technically recover in terms that they're back in a house, but they've used all of their savings. They had savings, they were planning for retirement, they were using their retirement funding, and now they've basically eliminated any of that support that they had before. And so reimbursement program is something that we're looking at adding as well. In terms of implementation of all these programs, we are kind of like the funders of everything. We work with our local nonprofits on the ground. We work with community action agencies. We local and county officials, housing authorities, long-term recovery groups. We try and use as many groups that are on the ground that are trusted and respected by the community, knowing that one, we are the state government officials, as well as using federal funding. It makes things a little bit nervous for a lot of folks. And so we're trying to be able to use a more trauma-informed approach so that we can ensure that folks will be able to recover and they will want to recover using the funds and the programs that we have as well. There's been a lot of talk about federal changes. And I was expecting there could be a question about this, so I just thought I would bite the bullet and talk about it. Yes, so HUD is been targeted for a lot of federal changes. As of right now, our program has been not affected a little bit in terms of how quickly we're able to get responses as we used to. Technical assistance, any sort of those types of things is definitely going to be reduced with the firings of their workers. And so we are just trying to kind of move forward as we can, knowing that there's just a lot in limbo, but it's making a lot of our folks on the ground and our survivors definitely nervous. But we would like to hopefully continue with our program and make sure that we can continue to get folks back home. So we'll end on some good news. We have over 200 applicants that are in our homeownership recovery program. So folks that are needing to rebuild or replace or repair their homes. We have folks that are currently closing on homes. So they've chosen to go the route of building a brand new manufactured home or a new home that's already been built. These are two of the ones that they've been able to close on recently. So that's very exciting. And we are working on having construction happening in the spring for some of our folks. So they'll be working to actually finally rebuild or repair their homes that they've been desperately waiting for many years to do. In terms of our multi-sector program that I talked about, our fancy program name for it is PEER. They're moving and shaking in that program. So over 19 million has been allocated towards infrastructure and economic revitalization and mitigation programs. Some of those include small business recovery funds, park infrastructure, rural fire district truck replacements, downtown revitalization, infrastructure improvements. They are doing a lot of really good work that is helping kind of bring these communities back to what they were before and even better. As well as our down payment assistance program. It's going to be launching in the summer. And we have counties and housing authorities and local cities finally signing off on doing their work in terms of building more affordable housing in their communities. So things are, it feels like things are getting started, which is ironic because it's 4.5 years after the disaster. But in terms of our programming, things are really starting to move, which we're very excited about. And we're just wanting to make sure that all of the Oregonians that were affected are able to go back into an affordable and safe home. And yeah, so that's our work. And that's it. That's our website. So if you want to, we have a ton of information on our website, rita.oregon.gov. Please check it out. There's a lot more if you want to get into the nitty gritty. This was very high level. So yeah. All right.